The unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha. Homage to the Dharma. Homage to the Sangha. Today I'm going to talk about working with our suffering. As we know, the Buddha said, I teach two things. I teach suffering and the ending of suffering. And he also said, among many other things, the root of suffering is a desire, wanting, based on the idea of a self, a me, that wants something or does not want something, because they're both two sides of the same thing. And he said, suffering is birth, old age, sickness and death, and pain, sorrow, lamentation, grief and despair, not getting what one wants and getting what one does not want. These are all suffering. This all sounds quite familiar. Well, there's immense suffering in our world, and it's always so. And at present it seems to have greatly increased because of the COVID pandemic. So many people have got sick and died, and they're still doing it. They're still getting sick and dying. We tend to think, oh, it's almost over, but it's not. Lots of people are still getting sick. Lots of people are dying. So many people grief-stricken, Yesterday, some of us attended a memorial ceremony for a good friend of ours who did not die of COVID. And there was grief and sadness. It was a lovely ceremony, and there was grief and sadness. And it's just as it should be. It's normal and it's fine. We're not saying you shouldn't be sad. Or, you wouldn't want not to feel grief at the death of a friend. There are wars, oppression, people discriminated against, people fleeing from violence and from starvation, all these awful things that we see in our world. And in many ways it's always been this way. And at present it seems to be worse. It always seems to be worse at present. I always say, it seems to be worse at present. Maybe it always seems to be worse now, And the Buddha was saying, he was not saying, just get over it. If you're suffering like this, it's your own fault. He said, suffering is in our mind, most of it, but not all. There may be karmic reasons for the situations people have to face. But they still have to deal with them. There's still a deep need for compassion and generosity and kindness. It's the very essence of Buddhism. And when the Buddha says, the root of suffering is desire, wanting and not wanting, he was not saying it's all your fault if you suffer. He was assuming the basics that people had, the basics of life, He would never say, just get over it if you're hungry. It would be completely unreasonable. One time that somebody came to see the Buddha, and he was starving, and he came for the Dharma, and the Buddha said, give him food first, then let him come. They said, what, you want the Dharma first? And the Buddha said, he's starving, guys, feed him. He knew what was important. You can't really hear the Dharma if you're really hungry. You've got to be able to have the basics of life. And he was assuming this when he talked about suffering. So you want to make that quite clear. You're not just saying, if all your family's died of COVID and you're not happy and you're sad and grief-stricken, it's your own fault. Well, of course, there's grief. Of course, there's sadness. Of course, you want to help the world. Of course, there's terrible things happening, but they're not people's fault. We do the best we can to help, as we can. But there's an awful lot we can do about our own suffering, our own angst, assuming that we're not starving or in mortal danger. We can do something about how we accept what comes our way, which is really how you deal with suffering. It's our own suffering that we create for ourselves that I'm talking about here. We all have our karmic conditions, the things we've done, things that have happened to us, whether in this life or a previous existence. And these karmic conditions have mostly made us the way we are now. We may see these causes or we may not, but what matters is what do we do about them now? How do we deal with them now? We have choices. We can do something about our suffering in whatever way we may experience it. And this is where we start from as Buddhists. We can do something about our suffering. There is suffering and there is the ending of suffering. We can do something about that. We might not be starving, but if we feel we're lacking something, that we don't have enough, and we're angry and envious of other people, then we're creating suffering for ourselves, and probably for other people too. It's independent of whether we actually have enough to eat or a roof over our head. That constant wanting more, feeling we don't have enough, that feeling of the bottomless pit, that's the suffering that we actually create for ourselves. And that's what we can do something about. All the other kinds of suffering, anger, delusion, and all that. And as the Buddha says, our suffering is basically caused by clinging to what we think of as our self, me. What they call the 5 aggregates, the skandhas of body, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness. These are the things that make up me. We don't have to go into them all now, but they're the parts that make up what I experience as me. And the Buddha divided these things up so we could see, well, where is there a me in this? Is there a me in the body? Not exactly. Is there a me in my feelings? Not exactly. The me that wants things and does not want things. And this is what causes suffering. It's not accepting the way things are. It's wanting something else. That's the epitome of suffering. I want something else. I want to be kinder, I want to be nicer, I want to be happier, I want to be richer, I want to be somebody else. And it's none of it is, something's happening here, hang on a minute. It's all right. None of it is helpful. It's all suffering that we create for ourselves. Well, we can feel a bit disheartened when you look at this. We can feel daunted. It can seem impossible to say, well, we just need to let go of wanting things and not wanting things, to abandon all our desires and attachments, to be completely unmoved by the things we just can't stand or the things we really want, or by anger, to cut through all our delusion and realize wisdom, Sounds great. We think, how could I do that? There's Manjusri festival. There he is, sitting on his beast of self. Beast always wide awake. And Manju has his sword of wisdom to cut through all his greed, anger, and ignorance, because they do still come up, even when you're a bodhisattva. These things still arise, especially as little bodhisattvas trying to do our best. Greed, anger, delusion, they're not going to go away anytime soon. But to have the sword of wisdom, of mindfulness, sitting and seeing, don't do that. This is what's coming up. To recognize our selfishness. So how can we do that, us little bodhisattvas? It's all right, it's like thing, it's all very well for Manjusri, here he is with all his stuff, and but us little bodhisattvas, how do we manage to deal with all our anger and pettiness and crabbiness and jealousy and all that stuff? Well, actually, we do it moment by moment. We don't do it all at once. We don't cut through everything all at once and it's gone. It is a huge undertaking to work on our suffering. But we do it one moment at a time, one thought at a time, by practicing acceptance. Not that I want something else, but acceptance. This is what I have. Even when there is deep grief, if we can accept it with compassion for our moments of non-acceptance, those moments when we just feel terrible, if we can basically accept it and sit with it with a kind of softness and kindness, we will suffer a lot less. There'll still be that deep grief, but it's different than if we're railing against fate or angry and upset. If we can say, this is what's happened. Everybody dies, And we might have wished that they wouldn't die now, but it's happened. So our suffering, that kind of added self that we put into it, we can take responsibility for that, for how we create that suffering. And this means not blaming other people, not blaming our circumstances, even when they seem really unfair. If we're suffering in that way, that non-acceptance is because we need to do something different. It's as deeply compassionate. It might seem a little unsympathetic. Well, I'm suffering because I need to do something different. But actually, it's deeply compassionate because we can do something about it. We're not just stuck with it. We can accept. If we think our suffering is caused by other people or by our external circumstances, then we're looking outwards and we're blaming them for our suffering instead of looking at what we're doing. How am I responding to this? What am I doing? What am I bringing to this situation? And it makes it hard to accept what's going on if we keep thinking it's caused by other people. Looking outwards, blaming other people or other things, then we get stuck because we can't change because we don't see that we actually can change. Or we can know this intellectually. Oh yes, our suffering is caused by our own mind. And still not really apply it to ourselves, It sounds great, but then the mind is so convincing when we're right in the middle of it, angry or whatever, thinking we've got a right to be upset because other people are so unreasonable. They're so unreasonable. They won't do what I think they should do. They won't listen to me. They don't do what I like. They don't live the way I'd like them to live. Things are not going the way I want. Of course I should be upset. Actually, no, we can't actually change. This said situation is special. Yes, I want to be, work on my suffering, but this particular thing is just unusual. It's awful. It's outside the parameters, as it were. Or my karma is so heavy I can't deal with it. I'm unusually unhappy. It's unusually a heavy burden, and I can't do much about it. We can, no matter what it is, we can do something about our suffering, no matter what it may be. There are always stories of Tibetan lamas in prison and working with the pain, the suffering, and their worst fear being that they lose compassion for those who have jailed them and who torture them. That's really something to think of that somebody, their worst fear would be losing compassion. Never mind what happens to their own body, So we can, not all Tibetan lamas, but it shows us that there is a way through. Clinging to our suffering makes it worse. Identifying with it, thinking, this is me. I am my despair, my anger, my sorrow, whatever it might be, my fear. I can't help it, I'm just an angry person. Can't do anything about it, Or a fearful person because I've been badly treated. These things are part of me. Well, they're not, They're not. They're part of our karmic inheritance, but they're not our fundamental nature. We can do something. We can change. So how do we do that? Well, first we look. We see the suffering, and we start with acceptance as best we can. This is what I'm like now. This is what I seem to be like now. I have a lot of anger. I have a great deal of fear. I have despair. Okay, what do? Not, I am this way and I'll always be this way. How do I change? How do I accept that and work with it? Because accepting is the first thing. Then we also work on the precepts. The precepts help us to stop creating suffering for ourselves and others. First in our actions, and in our speech, and then in our thoughts. Not acting angrily, not speaking angrily, and not thinking angry thoughts about others. All these different ways we try to keep the precepts. Speaking against others, killing little creatures, killing somebody's Buddha nature in our own mind because we're critical of them. They all connect together, all the precepts work together. And they're all ways of helping us to stop creating suffering in our own minds and for other people. To just stop doing that. Ceasing from evil, doing only good, doing good for others. The 3 pure precepts. That is how we relinquish suffering. And if we truly do this in the deepest ways we can, actually, that's everything. To cease from evil, do only good, do good for others in body, speech and mind. And there are other ways to help us with suffering. The 3 characteristics which I dearly love. Dukkha, anicca, anatta. Dukkha, suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Unsatisfactoriness. Life is unsatisfactory. Nothing is permanently going to make us happy. And we can see this as a negative thing. Well, life is dukkha, it's suffering is awful. Or we can take it positively. If life is unsatisfactory, and the things of life are not completely satisfying, then I can accept that. If I can accept that, and not expect it to be perfect, not expect to be happy forever, not expect that one day I'll be happy, one day I'll be enlightened and then I'll be happy and everything will be fine. One day I'll have what I want, one day I'll get the perfect partner, one day I'll get the lovely perfect job, one day I'll be completely healthy. It's always going to be something, you know. And to apply that, we look at the mind to see how we cling on to things. If things don't turn out the way we want, we have a choice. We can blame somebody else, or we can blame the conditions, or we can reflect. This may not be a huge thing, or it may be a big thing. I just don't like it, but it's what I've got. What am I going to do? Am I going to accept it and work with it, or am I going to keep complaining about it and saying this isn't fair? You know. And when we think, yes, life is not completely satisfactory, it kind of puts things in perspective. You know? When desire arises, we want something, especially if it's something that we really shouldn't have, we have a choice. We can feed it. I want that, I want that, I want that. And that's suffering. Because none of the things we desire are ultimately satisfying, especially when it's something we really shouldn't pursue. Or we can see the desire arise. Watch the mind, see it arise. Stop feeding it and let it die away. We're not squashing it. We're just not feeding it with wanting. And it will eventually, maybe take a long time, eventually it withers because we're not feeding it. Not giving things undue importance. It's just something we happen to want or something we don't want. It's not the great important thing. The things we want will not take away suffering, however enticing they may seem. Even the desire for enlightenment is still a wanting, it's still a desire for something. I want such and such. Me wanting enlightenment is kind of an oxymoron, really. Anicca, impermanence, everything changes. Nothing is permanent, nothing we can cling on to, nothing we can hold on to, because everything changes all the time. We talk about this a lot. And again, you can see it as a negative thing, or you can take it positively. Whatever's going on, it won't last forever, it will change. Whether I like it or I don't like it, it's not going to last forever. Including my state of mind. If I'm filled with despair, it will change. It may feel like it's going to last forever, that this cold, impenetrable fog is just stuck there forever, but actually, it just feels that way. It does lift, things do change. Our states of mind do change. Whatever it is that seems so hard to bear or so hard to deal with, they do change, especially if we work with them, recognize them, and try not to feed them, not to feed our despair, our fear, anger and all that. And any state of mind, resentment, we can work with them. And we can bear in mind that they will and do change, especially if we do our best with them. And the positive states also, joy and happiness, they change too. We can't cling on to them forever. We can't expect some joyful state to last, because it won't. So, when it disappears, that was nice, now it's gone. Fine. Everything changes, everything passes away, nothing we can hold on to. And the more we see impermanence, the less we attach importance to any of these states of mind. They just weather. They pass through like clouds and sun. And the less we attach to our outward circumstances, gain and loss, fame and disgrace, praise and blame, elation and sorrow, those lovely 8 characteristics, 8 worldly winds, 8 worldly conditions. They're always there. Anatta, no separate self, the trickiest one of the 3, is harder to understand. There is no me, no separate me that I need to uphold and protect. It's only my self-partiality that makes me unhappy, as the Buddha said, wanting and not wanting, based on this idea of a self that wants things. I want this, I don't want that, I like this person, I can't stand that person, I want this, I want that. Constantly wanting and not wanting, based on a me that wants and doesn't want. If we didn't have that sense of a self, we wouldn't have all that wanting and not wanting. Yes, we still get hungry, we still need to eat and all those things, but that clinging to things, or pushing things away. And this idea of a self, as the Buddha said, is actually the very root of suffering. It's that ignorance, the basic ignorance, thinking that we are a separate self that has to be protected, given what it wants, kept away from what it doesn't want, and all that. When we're suffering, there's a self at the bottom of it, generally. My view of what should be done, my view of what's important, my view of what would be nice, how I would like things. It's all about me. And when we see that self-partiality, this me, it's easier to let it go. Oh, that's just my selfishness. I don't have to have it my way. I just think it's, because I think I'm so smart. It doesn't have to be the way I want it. Maybe it'll be just fine the way another person likes it. We don't have to have things the way we want. People just aren't doing things my way, that's all. Oh, okay. It puts it in perspective. Even if we don't like it, we can say, what is it about me that doesn't like this? And at the bottom of it, there's that little self, big self. I don't always have to get what I want. It's not going to make me happy, actually, because things change. We always have a choice, and often we don't see it. We think we have to react in a certain way because we've always done that, and we can change. Because we look outside ourselves and blame circumstances, we think it's their fault, it's not my fault, or it doesn't have to be even a thinking of a fault. Just, how can I accept this? How can I work with it? Maybe I do need to change something. I do need to do something. But I don't have to blame either other people or myself. How do I work with that? The hook, the outward circumstances. If I'm angry and I keep seeing causes for anger, well, the anger's in me. It's not in all those outward things. It's not in all these other people who are being annoying. It's in me, my irritation, my own anger. And with our mindfulness, our awareness, our paying attention, we can see what we're doing, look at the mind. And we can look at things through these 3 characteristics, dukkha, anicca, anatta, unsatisfactoriness, everything changes, no separate self in anything. And see things in perspective, not just from our own little point of view. See how we create our own suffering. And we can learn to change our habits of thought and actions and words. Sometimes they're quite subtle, just a lingering little thought of clinging to something, or a lingering little mild, anxiety about something that actually doesn't matter at all. Just to look and say, what am I worrying about? Why do I feel unhappy? I'm just worrying about that little thing. Well, so what if it happens? It doesn't matter. It's really not a big deal. To notice more when we practice awareness and mindfulness, watching the mind, we notice more what our mind gets up to. When we have a feeling of discomfort, what is that? What's causing that discomfort? I'm a little bit annoyed by what that person did. And if I can see that, then I don't have to then snark at somebody else because I'm irritated. I can just say, okay, I'm irritated about that. Okay, Don't worry. And then you don't cling on to it and bark at somebody else. A lot of our dis-ease actually comes from very minor things, fears, worries, irritations, upsets, whatever it might be. A lot of it's really minor, and it's usually based on a self that wants something else, you know. And if you can see all this without making judgments about it, just look at the mind, look at the suffering, how we've created it. Then we can learn to let it go. Apply the remedy. You won't create a whole lot of new suffering by setting up some ideal of the non-suffering ideal me. You know, here I am, a non-suffering ideal self. It's just adding insult to injury, as it were, making ourselves miserable because we're not perfect. It's just, look what I'm doing. Okay, it's okay. I don't have to get all bent out of shape about that. Accepting what we've got, accepting what we have, and then working with it. That's how we do that. Otherwise, if we're not accepting, then it's harder to see and harder to work with. Pain and sickness, the ills of the body, as the Buddha says, you know, these 5 contemplations. I'm going to get old, if I'm not old already. There's no escape from that. I'm going to get sick. There's no escape from that. I'm going to die. No escape from that. I'm going to be separated from everything I love. No escape from that. And the 5th reflection, I am the inheritor of my karma, of the consequences of my actions. That is what all I have, is actually the karma of my good and bad actions. Karma is good as well as bad can be. That's what I have, the results of my own actions. All the things I love, all the things I cling to, my own body and mind that are going to be gone. This is my karma. So, what I do now matters. And this is a great blessing. You know, it's a great blessing to remember. If I'm sick, this is how it is. This is normal. If I'm old, right, you know, and eventually I will die. It would be pretty funny if we didn't. But people don't like to look at that. But just, these are all so. This is how it is. This is the way things are. To accept it as best I can, and accept our own karmic consequences, and do the best we can not to create new suffering for ourselves and others. Meditation with pain and sickness, with old age, with approaching death. We all, most of us practice meditation, and we know it's a huge help to learn to sit still with all these things. When fear comes, when pain comes, when sickness comes, they can actually help us. They can help us to practice acceptance. They can help us to practice compassion for others, to have sympathy with others who are sick or old or dying, because we have a sense of what it's like. We know what it's like to be sick, so we can be sympathetic. Somebody who's never had a moment of illness in their life, it finds it harder to be sympathetic to somebody who's chronically ill, for instance. But if we have illness, or we have a lot of pain, I know what that's like. I know what it's like to live with chronic pain, or whatever it might be. And we can sympathize and maybe help, And to work on acceptance, sitting still in the midst of it, is a huge help. Otherwise it's just misery. If we have chronic pain, how do we work with that? To work on acceptance, to allow it to soften our heart, to teach us kindness and sympathy with all beings who suffer. All beings suffer one way and another. It really helps us. Remembering the example of those old Thai forest monks who would go and sit in the forest and hear the tigers roaring and be scared to death, maybe, and sit through that fear, And mostly the tigers did not eat them. Maybe they might have eaten one or two, but mostly they didn't. Malaria, they'd get malaria and sit through it. They wouldn't just, lie in bed. There's this lovely story of one of the monks really ill with malaria. Malaria is a horrible thing to have, really sick, just wanting to die probably. And Ajahn Mun shows up, his teacher. Ajahn Mun was a really ferocious teacher, and he had malaria, that had malaria, they all had malaria. And Ajahn Mun says, "Why are you lying here like a foot-wiping rag? Get up and sit." So the guy gets up and sits and eventually gets better. But I like that, like a foot-wiping rag, about as grotty as you can get. Why are you lying there like a foot-wiping rag? So I've always remembered this, foot-wiping rag. So it doesn't mean that any time we're ill we have to be afraid we're like a foot-wiping rag, but this is their practice, how they worked with pain and sickness and used it to the good. And we don't have to do it quite that way necessarily. That's what they did. Sitting in the forest with the tigers, we don't have to go looking for tigers. We have enough pain and fear and sorrow and sickness and all that of our own without looking for more. We can find it in our own mind. We don't have to look for tigers outside. We don't have to look for pain and sickness outside. We have all these things in our own minds, in our own past, in our own thoughts, and we can see them and work with them. Suffering is not useless. It teaches us acceptance. It gets our attention. It shows us where we're clinging on to things. I want something else, It shows us where we're breaking the precepts, because when we break the precepts, we suffer. We feel bad. We get bad consequences, It shows us where we're harming other beings and where we're selfish, because we suffer. And we can use the suffering to look at our mind and see what we're doing. And that's how we purify the mind, looking at it, seeing the suffering that we've created for ourselves and for other beings, with kindness and compassion and acceptance, not with judgment and criticism. Oh God, that's just awful. Oh, what a horrible person I am. That doesn't help at all, but this is what I did. I can change. I can do better now. I can learn from that dreadful mistake I made in the past. I don't have to do that now. Maybe I can't do anything about the outward circumstances, but I can do something about my own mind so that I don't keep doing that. This huge task of converting our greed, anger and selfishness and delusion is not impossible. You just do it one thought, one breath at a time, one moment at a time, and we keep on doing it with kindness and compassion, as I said. Not holding a stick over our own head to try and force us to live up to some ideal, just adding delusion to delusion, really. It's not the ending of suffering. Using our mind to work with the mind, with kindness and acceptance. Manjusri, sitting on his beast of self, holding his sword of wisdom, It's not an accident that the Bodhisattva of wisdom is sitting on his beast of self, because it's converting the selfishness that brings us to wisdom. When we're selfish, we're not acting with wisdom. When we're acting with wisdom, there's no selfishness in there. True wisdom, the wisdom of the heart, has nothing to do with what I want. It's just, what's good to do here? What's good to do here? The attentiveness. What do I need to do here? What's best? How do I help this person? How do I help myself? How do I deal with this situation? Not what do I want? What's best? It's different from what I want. Converting the self, softening it, working with it, not feeling that we're separate from it, because Manjusri and his beast are really one being. They're not separate. Manjusri is not beating his beast. He's sitting with his beast. The beast is wide awake. He's not going to, fall asleep. Okay, Manjusri is in charge. He's wide awake, ready to jump up at a moment's notice if Manjusri takes his eye off him. Because we need to watch the self. Itself is always there. It can always jump up and bite us on the nose. We think we're doing fine, and then boing, the self clinging to the end of our nose like this. What's this? We all know what that's like. You do something really dumb, really selfish, really embarrassing. We all do that. And then just here we are. Here's myself clinging to my nose. Maybe I can just put it down and get my breath back, and try not to do that again. great wisdom. Nothing is separate from anything else. That beast of self is not separate from wisdom, and it's not separate from other beings. We're not separate from other beings. And that is the great thing about anatta, non-self, that we're not a separate little me that has to be protected and defended against everything else. We're part of everything else. Nothing needs to be defended. Fundamentally, we're all the same. Whether we like people or hate them, we all have the same stuff. We've all got greed, anger, and delusion. We've all got Buddha nature. We've all got the potential to do immense harm or immense good. Some people are worthy of veneration, we may think. Some people we may think should be locked up so they don't kill people. But we all have those potentials in all those different ways. Nothing separate, nothing special. Nothing special about us. We're just like everybody else in certain ways. But it's what we do that makes a difference, and we have that choice. Selfishness is just believing in that separate self, thinking we're separate and somehow special. And that's the cause of all our greed, hate, and delusion, the basic ignorance, thinking the self is real. And great wisdom sees through this. And still that beast is there, and Manjusri still has his sword ready to cut through those fetters of greed and ignorance. Because you don't cut through them just once, they keep on arising, you keep cutting through them. Just with the mind, look at that, I'm getting ready to say something unkind, or just an unkind thought is there, I don't have to feed it. Look what I'm doing, I think there's crabby little thought about so-and-so. I don't have to do that, let's just let it go. Constant work, constant job, it's not done once and for all, constantly. That beast is awake. And our selfishness is what helps us to practice wisdom. If we didn't have selfishness and anger and delusion, all that arise, we wouldn't have to learn wisdom. We would just live our life, We wouldn't learn compassion for ourselves and others as they make mistakes, as we make mistakes. Because we've made the same mistakes they've made, probably. And we can think, I did that. I've done that. I've been there. I don't have to judge this person because they did something not very smart. The things we find most difficult can help us most, because we have to work on them. It's too painful not to. The very impediments we find can really help us. We can be grateful for the difficulties. We can be grateful to Manjusri and his beast, because they're in harmony. One being. We are one with our own selfish nature, and we're one with that Buddha nature. We have our sword of wisdom, we have our wide-awake self, and we can practice kindness towards ourselves and our weaknesses, kindness towards other beings and their mistakes, their weaknesses too, kindness to all of us, because none of us is separate. We are all actually in it together. And that's Manjusri's teaching for us today. Thank you.